I think in any society, there would have to be a mechanism, as you described, of adjudication, right? Of conflict resolution. What I'm talking about, though, is not at the exclusion of that. What I'm talking about is that the the decision-making norms of that society, right? Whether it's how laws are decided or how the most important decisions that affect your life, how those decisions are made, should be, in my opinion, done by those who are most affected by those decisions. So I'm not saying that this is a complete.
But who gets to decide who's the most affected? This is precisely where naivety comes into the picture. That's a proposition. Yeah.
Okay. So the first question
gets to decide that, because it's an interactive relationship.
I agree. Yeah. So the first question is this ideal worthy? Okay. So if you're saying yes, I think it's a good ideal. If we can move society in a more free and more liberatory direction, that's a good thing. If you agree with that, so then the next question is, how do we implement it?
No, right? It depends on the cost.
It depends on, okay.
You can make a totalitarian society being libertarian for sure. But then it becomes totalitarian. It's an enormous cost to actually pay. I'm not buying that we would have freedom from things at any cost. Just like I'm not buying that people can have freedom to certain things at any cost. But freedom to and freedom from are different things. And at the end of the day, this is a balancing act, and it also has to be sustainable.
Okay.
Because all the things you're talking about actually are in the US Constitution. America could be all those things you're talking about. The question is the rather pragmatic one. Why isn't it?
Well,
okay.
There's a lot of questions there. Yeah, there's a lot of questions there. So, so I think if we agree that people are more fulfilled when they have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, if that's an agreement, then the next question would be, how do we move society in that direction? Okay, so I agree with you that there will never be a society that is 100% gets the calculus of proportionate say correct. Okay, I doubt there will ever be such a society. The question is that how do we move our societal institutions closer to that ideal? Okay, I'm not saying that we will ever have perfection. What I'm saying is that's the direction to go. And the closer we get, the better. So if that's something we agree upon, then the next conversation should be, how do we alter our society's social institutions or political institutions to better reflect that? Okay.
Well, you can't do that before you answer the question of the freedom to, freedom from, which really here is equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. And that's an enormous difference in a complex society like ours. So, for example, I love Marx, but I hate Rousseau. So I love the heroic perspective of giving everybody the chance that it's somehow similar in life to succeed. But I'm not buying the current sort of woke thing with equality of outcome at all. And like most Marxists, actually,
I don't advocate that either.
No, okay, so then we agree. But that's a typical example of something you have to solve before you make the move you just suggested.
Right. So, okay. So what I think is, for example, in the U.S., okay, we have a certain political structure, correct? We have certain political institutions, whether it's, the presidency, the Congress, and so on and so forth. Okay, can we move those to better reflect this ideal? And I think the answer to that is yes. Can we have nested councils, a system of nested councils, so that people can start engaging much more locally, right, in the decisions that affect their own communities, right, under the ideal that if a decision only affects your community, only you and your community should make that decision. And only when that decision affects other communities does it get bumped up to the next level.
Who decides that? Again, you're leaving the problem in the air. I can give you a proposal here.
So let me answer. Let me just answer it directly.
Yeah, but if you look at the United States, say you look at the United States and China and Brazil and Russia and India, what do these 5 empires today have in common? Enormous class differences. So I think what you're proposing, actually, I would be more than happy if somebody made a Brexit in North America. So one of the states of the United States left the United States, went independent, and tried a different model. I think that's the best thing that could ever happen. So that's why I'm enthusiastic about Brexit, because I think the smaller the unit is, rather than everything being run from Washington, D.C. and maybe Silicon Valley, like America's now, the harder it is to get over these enormous class differences that North America has.
Yeah, fair enough. But to answer your question about who decides, I think that first we establish the ideal, okay? Then we have to determine if we can have societal institutions that better approximate that. Let me exaggerate to make a point, okay? Let's say we're looking at a dictatorship, right? It's pretty non-controversial to say, okay, well, in a dictatorship, you get virtually no say in anything, right? And that's not good. And the move of going to representative democracy from a dictatorship is a good move, right? Because at least there's some element of representative representation, right? You're moving in a good direction, right? Who gets to decide that is a better system than a dictatorship? Well, we do, right? Us as participants in that society can say, well, in a dictatorship, I got no say. In this society, I get at least a little bit of say, but I want a society where I have more say in the decisions that affect my life. Okay, so
but there are limits. There are limits to those things too. That's why direct democracies don't work. That's why representative democracy tends to be much better in the long run. So there are limits to those ideas too. I want to kill your idealism and make you a radical pragmatist.
It seems that democracy in general has taken a lot of L's, though, I would say. I mean, I think to interject, I think a good question. By the way, thank you guys for coming. It's always a pleasure to have both of you.
And everybody subscribe right now. All the people who are watching this, we have 94 people. I think we had 100 at a certain point, and we were probably going to get 100 people, 100 more people. I want to get this to 200 people. So anyway, guys, subscribe right now. Anyway, Gio, go for it.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you three on here on the show. But no, I think
super chat and super chat
and Patreon. So no, but I think that a good question would be what Bard you were getting at about the question of freedom in general, but also the assumption, or rather the images of thought that people have in terms of democracy itself equates freedom, equates goodness. I think that we should problematize that to the extent of what is freedom for, and what is the limits of, not just the limits of freedom, that seems kind of basic, but at the root, it's also what, because having read your prolific tweet threads, Arash, I agree with you in that the way that the system is structured in such a way that people really don't have a fundamental say in things that do affect their lives. Like you were talking about in your thread, how capitalism does not reward, or rather late capitalism does not reward innovation, but rather it's the externalization of costs. So for example, and by the way, there actually was a 14-year-old kid that had a miniature nuclear thing in his backyard that he disassembled. But
legalize recreational nukes.
Yeah, look up Nuclear Boy. I think that's what his name was. There's a documentary on him. But like for example, the externalization of cost is, to me, one of the most readily apparent things in the food industry. So, for example, why is it cheaper to add atrazine to like crops than growing them organically?
Right.
That creates super bugs that create untold horrific health hazards to people. Those kind of things, they get lost in the discourse because it's very easy to look at the rate of consumption that is present and to ask the serious questions about why is it that we need a McDonald's on every corner? Why is it that we need mass distribution that is in fact actuality the food distribution networks aren't serving the people properly? So you point to this, and I agree with you. And I think that there is a lot of evidence to say that the sort of, what would you say, basic Milton Friedman, like creative destruction, Friedrich Hayek stuff is becoming increasingly not that it doesn't exist, but creative destruction in the free market, it's kind of like an oversold entity, in that in actuality, if there is stagnation that breeds better profitability, then that's always going to be the path of least resistance. So I agree with you, but the question is whether we could do this in a way that isn't going to rely on greater centralization of authority. I think that that's almost an impossibility, in my opinion, as societies get more complex.
Oh man, that's like the heart of like everything that I feel like I try to do.
Oh, okay, yeah, there you go.
That like is I think it is, right? I think the centralization of authority and the centralization of decisions is always to the detriment, right? I mean, it's what is the most like common saying of like human nature, right? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. I mean, is there one person that would disagree with that? Right?
Well, I think that if power, I would say that it depends on the centralization, because it depends on.
But guys, this is why I wanted to bring in the United. This is why I wanted to bring in the United States as an empire into the picture, because you are in North America at the moment. Well, Gio, you're in Canada, right?
Oh, we're pretty much America, but it's
okay.
Well, Canada.
No, you are Canada. You are actually independent from the United States, so you have a say. Canada's legally everywhere to begin with. Anyway, this is why another way of looking at this, another approach, and again, we're going to write a class analysis to look at how human beings actually operate, what we call anthropology. So we know that human beings have a strong loyalty towards family, they have a strong loyalty towards clan size, and they have a strong loyalty towards tribe. That's how they lived for hundreds of thousands of years. And over the last 4,000 years, starting with the Persians, we invented larger entities. We call these larger entities nations and empires. Okay, the problem is that nations and empires, the bigger they are, arrive at scale. And with scale, we've been taught that there's certain advantages. Well, there are, right? But they have to operate in certain manners to make any sense. The problem, though, is that in an increasingly complex world, we've increasingly alienated, and now going digital, and digital is going global. Human beings tend to go more local the more global the technology goes. So whereas we have these global technological empires today, I've written a lot about them, we have the alternative to that, which is that human beings respond by going more local. That is why we have a general trend towards decentralization. I don't think you can take the debate on decentralization in America seriously unless you make smaller, stronger spheres with stronger membranes that cannot be controlled by Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley. That's precisely what I'm saying, that what Arash is proposing is impossible in the United States. It's also impossible in China, Russia, Brazil, and India, because these entities are too big. And that's why we're now in Europe struggling with the European Union, because it's becoming too bureaucratic. It has no advantage for European citizens. We can communicate with each other across the borders anyway these days through digital. And we're trying to figure out maybe Europe should go the other way and actually reinvent the model where countries like Switzerland and Sweden and Belgium are actually better than these huge imperial models. Because that's how we arrive what Arash is asking for. You should be able to go into the street, and the elected politician you know should be somebody you should know. And the less power your elected politician that you know has, the further away that power goes to a bigger system. And suddenly you live in a country or a culture where Jeff Bezos and silly Donald Trump are the most two powerful people, none of whom you have any idea who they are, and you have no access to them. That's when you start feeling really powerless. Right. And that's why we have to rethink the spheres that we have invented over the last 4,000 years. When is empire really appropriate? When does it actually make sense for empire to operate? When can markets operate at their best when they're empires? And when does empire not work? And that's why I think, trashing big tech right now, repeating what America did in the 1890s with big oil, things like that are really the way forward, because you need to discuss these things in America. But I also think people in America need to ask themselves the serious question, why doesn't one of the states leave? Mm-hmm. What would that mean? It would create, if Vermont or Hawaii or somebody would leave, what kind of model would that be?
By the way, speaking of writing and your work, shameless plug, I know, but please go and buy the Futurica trilogy. Please go and buy it. You'll never regret it. And in fact, I've just flipped to a random page 109. and I think it's very relevant. On a purely material level, everything suggests that the underclass can continue to expect a certain improvements. The social elevation of the underclass, which begins with capitalism, will continue and assume new forms. But because the new underclass is characterized by its patterns of consumption and not by its relatively high living standards, it is not possible to speak of any genuine reduction in the distance between the classes. A member of the consumeritarian will not become a netocrat simply because he gets a larger apartment or a bigger car. So I think that's great because it highlights how people confuse what is the actual metric of higher living standards and greater say in what they mean in terms of their society. Because people think that, you know, the poorest person in America can buy an iPhone. Is that really a metric of social health? And I think that is a good, what both you and Arash are talking about. Because right now we're seeing the dawn of the consumer society where the decisions being made, but also the products that are being made. And again, this is like Marxist orthodoxy about being alienated from one's consumption and labor. Now, consumption itself is a form of alienation, not just labor, because people are alienated from that very act of consumption as well.
It just got even more complicated because even if capital is more important, capitalism is over, being replaced by attentionalism. And because attentionalism has taken over the world over the last 10 years, that makes it even more complicated. The class issue is now like two axes. There's one which is wealth and income, and the other one is the attentional one, which is credibility, the credibility and awareness of our eyeballs and our ears and everything. And that makes it fiendishly difficult for the capitalists themselves to begin with, but also for everybody else to orientate ourselves.
Well, and look what they're doing also. Last point, and then I want to get to hopefully Effina and then Arash. Because Effina, you come from a country that was directly affected by the American Empire. And
very much so, yeah. The British and the American.
Yeah, and
it's Kuwait.
Yeah, and I would say that Kuwait. We were talking about this last stream yesterday about how Kuwait was like directly in the center of like the post-war. The post-Cold War American order in the 1990s. But I would say the last point would be when it comes to these patterns of attention and the attention economy. Look what just happened recently with Mark Zuckerberg banning Trump till the end of his presidency. I think that is indicative of where things are heading in the, whether you agree with Trump or not, the nightmarish scenario of social media corporations not just controlling patterns of production and consumption, but controlling the attention economy itself. You can name people, Alex Jones, Stefan Molyneux, whether they deserved it or not, being banned off of social media all on the same day. And that is akin in a way to the dramatic cutting off and severing of the attention economy itself that you talk about, Alexander, when the netocrat will be someone who sells the eyes and the ears and who knows, maybe selling the soul on the internet.
I would disagree. They don't sell your eyes and ears because you can't sell them. That's why capitalists hate attentionalism. Advertising is dying. Marketing is dying. They're getting more and more desperate. That's why they go for woke next. It's just a sign that it's all dying. The current fundamentalism is Muslim and it's not Christian. The current fundamentalism is capitalist. And this is the end of capitalism because you cannot buy people's eyeballs and you cannot buy people's ears. We hate advertising more than anything else in the world. But I'd love to hear Effina's take. You're the Sumerian here, you're like 10,000 years of culture, Effina.
That's me.
I'd love to hear your take on this. Where do you think America's at?
I think America is in the process of becoming a country just like China. And then eventually, just like North Korea, it's like, this might not be a very popular opinion, but I think that the way China is, and then North Korea is a more extreme version of China, I think that those two countries are blueprints to how every other country is going to be, because I believe that there is only one government that rules the entire planet rather than separate governments and separate ideologies and separate like capitalism, communism, whatever. Then the entire planet is a communist, authoritarian as well.
I'm working on that at the moment with a new book. I agree with you in the sense that there is a censocracy about to happen, meaning there are going to be censors everywhere around the planet, and this is going to centralize power enormously. without moralizing, though, I have, as a philosopher, to come up with some alternatives to the Chinese Communist Party. And I owe it to people in Hong Kong and Taiwan right now. But the only, if you don't moralize about it, though, there is a problem with centralization. It's not very creative. So it creates enormous. Jack Ma has been gone for 2 months in communist China. That is even more embarrassing than the storming of the Bastille last night. So it's just that there is a major problem with decentralization efforts. And that is why, at the end of the day, power structures tend to be triads rather than just monolithic. So power structures tend to be both symbolic, who owns the narrative, imaginary, who looks like power when you look around, the king or the politician, and then real, meaning who owns the assets and can process those assets. And they tend to be different talents. So over time, at least, we've been saved by the fact that we had an aristocracy that fought the monarchy and that fought the priests of the churches. And we repeated that with the bourgeoisie, which Karl Marx points out, the bourgeoisie replacing the aristocracy. We had the academics replacing the priests and the churches, and we then had politicians replacing the monarchs. So we'll see if that can happen again. At least the goal in my work with an autocracy is to see that at least this power would have to be split in the long term, because otherwise you get North Korea, but North Korea is poor. That is actually a good case against
North Korea is not
Stalinism.
poor. The government of North Korea is not poor. They get billions and trillions from China. It's the people who are poor, but the Kim family are extremely wealthy. They have resorts all over the country. Like, they're very, very rich. It's only the North Koreans themselves who are poor, and that's what usually happens in a communist system.
Same thing happened in the USSR, definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, so if I'm hearing kind of the trend of what I believe, just my interpretation of what everybody's kind of saying, is that, you know, societies in general today are moving towards consolidation of power, consolidation of economic and political power, as evidenced here in the US and across the world. And ultimately, that is not a good direction to go. Why? Because it's alienating, as we talked about. It's people will feel more and more alienated, more and more disconnected from the decisions that affect them. And so the better direction to go is obviously the opposite direction, right? I think the question, if that's something we kind of all agree with, which is more or less, you know, what I think kind of anarchism speaks to, is the decentralization of power, the decentralization and bringing what Alexander was talking about, bringing things much more locally to the much more tangible, to the much more where you can feel and participate and actually engage in the decisions that are affecting you in your community. We got to bring things back on that level.
Yeah, but this is not a moral question. This is a question of technology. So I work in China, for example.
To me, it is also a moral question, though.
It cannot be. You can't afford to make it moral before you address reality. You got to address reality first.
The reason I would say it's moral, I'm not going to let you finish, but I just wanted to make that one point, is that the reason I would say it is a moral question is because if our understanding of human nature is that, like I said at the beginning, if exercising our consciousness to have a say in the decisions that affects our lives is a source of fulfillment, which I believe from evolutionary biology, from
I know, Eric, but you can't.
Those are things that bring fulfillment, right?
No,
those are things that make us feel
listen to my point why I said you cannot afford to have a moral opinion here, because you got to address reality first before you have a moral opinion. Okay, I work in communist China, believe it or not, although I'm totally with Taiwan. But in communist China today, you can go into any communist party central computer. They have access to all the data in the entire country. You press the button, within a second, you know every fucking out of 1.4 billion Chinese citizens where they're located. Right away. That means you cannot afford to sit with that kind of structure to talk about we should all live in little communes and be centralized and anarchic and all that, because that's already becoming a possibility within our culture. You can then also say that doesn't mean the Chinese Communist Party is won as the only model in the world, because I think it's going to be very hard for Xi Jinping to run India the way he's run China, for example. So this is, for me, is more interesting to do cultural studies, to study technology, Then take your Karl Marx and your desires with you. But that's why I try to avoid moralism at this stage, because we cannot even afford to have moral discussions at this moment, because we're going to sit like little Platonist boys and talk about our ideals, when reality is totally different today. The technological environment we live in today is not the 1850s any longer. It's very, very different. So you can throw certain things into the system before those technologies are developed. At the end of the day, it's going to be very, very hard to avoid America becoming communist China. And I think that's exactly why Effina has a point here.
I understand. I think so. There's two, at least the way I see it, there's really two questions here, right? One is, what direction do we want to go? And I think we all agree, right? At least from what I'm hearing. The second question, so that's the question of direction that we should take society. The second question is, well, how do we get there, right? And that's a totally different question, because, like you said, that could just be, just a thought dream. That could just be us, talking about like something that's absolutely not possible. Or is it possible? I don't know.
Okay, I propose to be more Hegelian. I propose, number one, to have a reality check. Then number two, set out where we're going to go. And then three, how do we get there? I think if you avoid the number one thing, you're just being too naive to actually understand what's going on at the moment.
I mean, I would agree. But I also think there are ways of moving society in that direction. I think like in any sort of power structure, right? Power is never just freely given back, right?
No, but that's why I work with encryption. The best movement in the world, again, looking at the world, how it actually operates today, kids are using encrypted services enormously. They love Signal, they love Telegram, right? That is human. And that's where you and I probably agree when you look at the technology. Why do you think I work with hackers? I work with hackers because the only people who can cause trouble right now for communist China are going to be for centralized government and centralized technology in North America as well. Hackers. As far as I know right now, the hackers, they have Edward Snowden and Julian Assange as their messianic figures, and that's good, because the only thing we have right now that can throw things into the system and avoid the system becoming too centralized, it can go in our direction, which is toward decentralization instead, is to use technologies to decentralize society.